All right, hey guys. So I was recently sick, and I was sick enough that I actually ended up having to take some time off the gym. Obviously, I shouldn't be going to the gym when I'm really sick, not only because I'm not well, but because I might get others sick. Uh, but yeah, I ended up having to take off about 2 weeks, and in getting back into the gym, it actually made me really think about some of the things I do when I've taken a little bit of time off the gym as it relates to music practice, because I I feel like there's not this huge Venn diagram of people who are interested in music related to like lifting or anything, but actually, I picked up a patron, Mike, who apparently thought that was kind of an interesting thing. Um, and he had a question, and I'm actually going to get to that a little bit. Um, but ultimately, uh, I guess just to talk for people who aren't really aware, uh, kind of my thoughts about lifting. Uh, some of these are kind of widely accepted. Some of them are probably a little bit on my end. If you're getting into lifting, normally the way that people are going to tell you to organize your practice is probably to start doing something like full body 3 times a week, and then you might eventually you'll progress to where you're doing something like an upper lower split, so that you can put a little more emphasis on different parts of your body. Um, because like leg workouts are pretty intensive, systemically they take a lot out of you. Then I think the broad thing that everybody's going for these days is a push pull legs workout, so that you can emphasize enough of like your back and pulling muscles separate from your chest and pushing muscles. So your upper body split into 2 days and your legs are still on their own thing. Um, and that's where I was for a long time. Now, where I have moved, and this might be a little controversial, is the bro split, which is kind of the old school. You're splitting it up. You've got something like 5 days a week, 6 days a week that are split into specific things, so you can target very specific muscle groups. Um, Depending on your goals, this is not the way to go. Most people would argue it's inefficient, because the idea of a push pull leg split, and we're getting in the weeds here, but it's essentially so that you can have um, you're hitting all of the big muscle groups as often as possible based on their recovery, so that you can maximize and optimize the amount of stimulus you're giving to certain muscles. And so, like in a normal 7 day week, you would probably do like push pull legs, rest, push pull legs. Um, I actually would always modify that to have an extra day, so it was an 8 day rotation. I didn't have like Monday is this type thing. A lot of people like to have that, but I don't think that's a good idea either for lifting or for practice. Sometimes getting too rigid on that can cause problems. Now, if that works for you because your brain just resets every Monday or Sunday or whatever, go with that. But that's I find that some people get locked into that, and the problem that it'll cause when people do like a push pull leg split is they'll be like, oh, I'm tired on this leg day, and so they skip that leg day or they half ass it, and then they move on, and the next day for their lifting is push a push day or whatever, and they basically skipped leg day, and that's kind of a problem. And you just keep half-assing that day that you don't want. But if you don't allow yourself to do that, and you don't go, oh, I'm tired, I'm gonna go skip leg day, and it's Wednesday, and so I can't do legs on Thursday. Well, no, you can. You can just say push, pull, rest, legs. Um, I think that actually applies to the way that I would mention, probably talking about piano practice as well, so that you're not skipping those things that you suck at. I think this is the big problem that people have in general when they practice, is they really want to avoid practicing those things they suck at. And I actually think that putting them into a routine where um, it's kind of the next thing you do, and maybe if it's something that's really hard, that's the thing you focus on that day. Um, and you're not worrying about fitting everything else in, it's easier to not skimp on that really important thing that you need to focus on. But no, like I have moved to a bro split for my lifting, because I've been lifting for 6 years now, something like that, and I have, for one, I'm nearly 40, so I'm past my prime for all of those things. I have hit what is going to be my lifetime PRs for all of my big lifts. I've also lost more weight since hitting all of those PRs. And if you understand anything about lifting, like if you're a lower weight, you're just not going to be able to lift as much. Even if a lot of that's fat weight, you're just not going to be able to lift as heavy. So my numbers are where they're at. They're the maximum that they're going to be. I don't know if I mentioned this. And if anybody's curious, my max bench was a 265, just missed the 275. My max squat was 365, and my max deadlift was 495. And I'm never going to hit those numbers again, and I'm okay with that. But my goals have moved more towards aesthetics, and part of the problem is that I was just missing a lot of body parts, a lot of the smaller body parts. And I get why coaches tell you not to focus on these. The reason most people are going to say do full body, upper, lower, push, pull legs, and not do a bro split is because idiots focus way too heavily on the show muscles. They go in and they want to do 5 arm days, and they skip their back and they skip all these other things. And it is a problem because you get systemically where you're not as strong. This is a thing that happens in piano too. You focus on the things you want to do a lot, and then you're not good at a lot of these areas that include that, just real fundamental things. So like if you're bad at chords, or you're bad, well, let's say, here's a great example. If you're bad at your scales and arpeggios, you didn't want to focus on those fundamentals at all, but you want to go work on Bach, you're going to struggle. So having those fundamentals under your belt is going to help you with that. Same thing with all of your big compound lifts. If you're doing big compound pulling motion, you're going to get a lot of work on your biceps. And if you're doing big pushing motion, you're going to get a lot of work on your triceps. So you don't need to do a ton of isolation work on those. Now for me, that's the problem, is that I hit the wall. I absolutely maxed out basically what I could do in terms of strength. Now that's not necessarily size, but strength as it applies to those lifts. And my biceps in particular were a big lagging body part. My chest is a lagging body part for other reasons that I'll probably talk about in the future. And also there's just detail work. Like my back is large. My back is probably a stronger body part of mine, but it's there's detail work to be done there. Like when you really get in the weeds, there's a lot of very specific back musculature if you care about that stuff. And that, it's a similar thing with piano, but you need to have like that basic size and fundamentals before you start worrying about the really minute details. But anyway, that's where I'm at with all of that. And I guess where being sick and coming back to the gym relates to all of this is that when I jumped back in, now I was only out for 2 weeks, but when I jumped back in, I did a full body day. That's what I did because I needed to kind of reacclimate to everything and see where I was. And a lot of my numbers dropped off, and I mean, that's fine. Like that's not the end of the world. And I think that's how, if you take an extended break from piano, you should kind of do the same thing where you jump back to that most fundamental program. So let's talk a little bit about that, because this actually kind of lines up with what Mike had asked. He was asking what my equivalent to a 5x5 was. Now, hot take. Once again about lifting, I'm not a huge fan of 5x5. Like in retrospect, I did some 5x5 when I was starting out. I tried some of it. In retrospect, kind of in that same pedagogical mindset that I have with piano, 5x5 is lacking volume. You're working on very technical lifts, and you're only doing 5 reps. 5 sets of 5 reps, and yeah, you're going to get some total volume. That's 25 reps there. But I think that because you're meant to be consistently progressing with weight every single week very, very quickly, you will vastly outpace your actual control of strength. And you'll have this problem where you're not in control of it, and you want to hit that next number. You want those linear gains constantly with the number, the plates, the weight on the bar. And you start to let your form suffer a little bit at a time. This is 100% just like piano. And why, as much as I'm a fan of the metronome, especially with all your fundamentals, people get obsessed with making that progress. and they start to let all of their, the consistency and the evenness of their fingers get really sloppy because they want to put 5 more beats a minute on that metronome. And just like with lifting, like, okay, sure, when you start out, like, yeah, man, you can be adding 10 pounds every day. That's not going to last for very long. You get to where you're adding, okay, 5 pounds a week, and maybe 2.5, like it gets rough. And you're hoping to, make 5 pounds in a month. You're hoping to make 5 pounds in 6 months. Which, my goal was never strength anyway. That's a very specific type of training. Piano is a similar thing where there are specific styles and you train for them in very specific ways. But, you have to not push so hard. You need higher volume and you need to focus on quality volume, especially with your compound so you don't get hurt. So you want to do a lot of volume of these lifts. Yeah, it sucks that you're squatting the bar, but it's probably worth it to how can you squat the bar for 10 reps, for 15 reps, for 20 reps? I'm not even saying that's a good workout, but it's good technical work to make sure, okay, can I make depth? Can I control the descent of my squat and not just like dive bomb it? Are you getting more weight on the bar, but you're just not going as low until you're doing these tiny little quarter rep squats? Like, that's a problem. And it's a problem that I see quite a lot in the gym. It's insane how poorly people tend to train because they don't want to feel like pussies because they took weight off the bar. But like after all this time, I'm constantly in there doing, consistently I'll end up doing pretty low weights for specific types of exercises, and I just don't care because like that's not, my goals are different and I'm understanding what I'm focusing on. It's the same thing, you could be practicing your scales. Somebody who's really good could go in and practice their scales and decide, okay, I don't need to practice hands together 140 beats a minute. What if I practiced one hand at a time at 60 beats a minute? And I think I've said this before, but like it's crazy how much your right hand, if you're doing scales, your right hand will cover up your left hand. And your brain also sort of conflates what you're hearing so that if there's real unevenness in your left hand, you don't hear it in your right hand. And a lot of people have, something where they're crossing. And, their crosses are like super rough because they're, whatever finger's crossing, they're just slamming on the other side. Or they have the... It's real uneven. And you put your hands together and you don't quite hear it. You can hear a little there. I can't fake it very well, but, your left hand will be weaker than your right hand. And my left hand is weaker than my right hand in my scales. But I can get enough velocity that you can't tell. But, like I've said, like that's not how you're going to play music. You're very rarely going to be playing scales with both hands. It's more often that I'll end up with a scalar passage or an arpeggiated passage in my left hand, which is weaker, and you can hear it. All of that unevenness, you can hear it. The heavy thumbs, the heavy crossings, you hear it because they don't have the control. So yeah, you can be a big shot, think you're a big shot, and just drop the weight down or drop the tempo down and go to one hand, and it's not as flashy, but that's useful. And at least, with piano, you're usually in a room by yourself. So who do you have to prove anything to? It's in the gym, I think everybody's too worried at what everybody else thinks. Yeah, I think that ends up being a problem in music school. This was always a problem. I ran into it myself. I fell into this trap. But like in music school, you're sharing walls with other people practicing, and they're all practicing their hardest shit, and they sound amazing. I'm like, oh my God, they sound so crazy good in there. Okay, they're practicing on the thing they're already good at and kind of showing off at it, and now you feel compelled to do the same thing. This is another reason I even think that headphones are good for practicing. If you're practicing at home, and there's anybody else just listening who's not a musician, you feel like you need to be doing something impressive, or just not annoying, and so you tend to gravitate towards things you don't actually need to practice on and avoid the things you do need to practice on. Man, this has been a lot of rambling. I feel like I'm not getting to my point. So, well, let's get back to, I don't think 5x5 is a great lifting protocol for beginners as much as people really like that. Yes, you will build up your strength faster, which will contribute in some ways to some better stuff, but I don't I don't know that that's a good approach because people will end up leading themselves to injury out of uh, ego. So, but that aside, that's semantics. What I think good beginning stuff is for musicians. I grabbed me some books here. So I like the Alfred book, the little all-in-one book. It's I'm not. It's not a big deal. Like the Alfred book is not. It's not the one. I just happen to like it. You know, I've looked through some others, and I don't know. I would honestly love to go through and review some other books at some point. I think. Just like work through them and think through them pedagogically, what I think, and evaluate them. I wish I had some more time for that because I think that would be fun. But this is one that I just know it kind of works. There are a lot of things I like about it. It's fairly clearly progressive in terms of systematically adding difficulty and building on the same concepts. It has a little bit of theory in it, so you're at least going to maybe be able to pay attention and get some of the concepts that would apply later to comping strategies. Um, it's something where, and they're short. It's lots of little short things. Now, the things that suck about the Alfred book is it's got, the tunes are lame. Like everybody is going to agree, the tunes are lame. Um, but it's one of those things that sometimes you kind of just have to work through that because like they're doing that thing that I always say, like you want a lot of small hurdles in this book. Each new tune is going to have a couple of small hurdles. They're short little tunes with small hurdles, and they're worth all clearing. And it does. It actually works well with one of the other books I'm going to mention because a lot of the left hand patterns really are these basic cadence patterns, right? That kind of thing. That's super important and valuable. And so those are going to be useful long term when you want to do more comping stuff, or if you want to play just different stuff under maybe in a lead sheet or something. So it doesn't really tell you how to do that, but it does translate to that eventually. I will say maybe another weakness is that it does stick to pretty limited harmony. I think that's practical for most people, but there are benefits to other books that maybe have some more interesting harmony. And obviously everybody's going to know that I think the Hannah Smith book is kind of awesome. It's a great way to get started with sight reading, even at a very, very low level, and it will help diagnose a lot of problems. I actually recently, because I haven't been sight reading a lot, I've been actively reading a ton because I have so much music going on. But that's very different from sight reading, like keeping your eyes on the page with something you know and you've been working on, and making sure you're keeping that association. That's one thing, and it's a very useful skill to have, but it's very different from picking up a piece of music you've never seen and just reading it. And I find myself falling into this trap that I used to have where my brain would sort of stop at the bar line. I keep not reading ahead of the bar line, and I don't learn to auto-regulate my tempo to read in time. And that's a thing that you need to do, and this book's great because if you find you're doing that thing where you're kind of gapping in the bar line and kind of stilted, you learn to regulate your tempo, reading at maybe a variable tempo, but then because you've found that evenness, you get better at reading more consistently faster. The tempo gets better over time. Now, probably one of the big ones is this one: scales, chords, arpeggios, and cadences. I'm sure there are other books. This one's just good. I like this. Not everything in here is fantastic or is necessary, but if you learned everything in this book, it would not be a bad thing. Normally what I say to people is, you have it in every key. The thing is, every scale will have, it has your scales in these different variations. So you've got 2 octaves up and down, but then you've got contrary motion scales, parallel, thirds or tenths, and parallel sixths. Those are useful later. There's some coordination things that are useful in there. I would say if you're starting, really, really focus in on your major scales up and down and your major arpeggios, because they also have dominant 7th arpeggios. Yes, those are useful. Prioritize them later. I would say learn all of your scales in the major and minor keys, your arpeggios in the major and minor keys, and then your cadences. This is the really important one. I know you probably can absolutely not see that, but yeah, it's basically, it's the cadence patterns. It's these in each inversion, and those are just absolute. That there's so many things built into that I can't even start. Like it's just crazy because like you're accidentally internalizing a ton of voice leading ideas. You are learning motion that is just going to carry across to just almost all kinds of music that you play. It's just insane how much that is just a foundational thing to everything you're going to do. I will add one other book that I normally used to not add into my little, I don't know, my golden triad of stuff you should learn, but this one I end up bringing up a lot. It's Progressive Steps to Syncopation for the Modern Drummer. I think I've shown this before. I mean, it starts with stuff like this, if you can see that. These are really, really, really easy rhythms. Just pat one in each hand. And, they've got rests. So you're learning to rest and keep good time. And then, it just gets denser. It's very, very progressive where you're just very slowly adding different rhythm variations. But if you can do this, rhythm to me is kind of the lowest tier in terms of reading. Like, it's the skill that you can master the fastest. And then in the long term, it's not going to be the rhythm that's ever going to be your problem. It's going to be, how fast can I read this giant stack of notes? But if you get the rhythm thing out of the way and you're just done to where the rhythm is just a foregone conclusion to you, then you can focus on other things. And so I think that's a good place to get to, is to really try to get your rhythm reading at that level. And so, like with me going back to the gym and jumping back in, kind of a full body program briefly. And in the past, when I've taken I had to take 3 months off years ago, and I was very slowly working my way through those steps: full body, upper, lower, and then PPL, where I kind of settled for a really long time. But yeah, so if you take a lot of time off of an instrument, spend a lot of time going back and just reviewing all of those things. Make sure that you can get your, you had your scales and stuff down, but make sure you go back and recover those ideas. And yeah, read back through something like an Alfred book or just any method book that's kind of aimed at beginners, just to kind of see where you're at, and do some easy sight reading to see where you're at, because sometimes you can't just jump back in, or you'll neglect things because you're jumping back in and you've let some of your technical stuff kind of suffer and you're not even realizing it. So it's worth revisiting that stuff occasionally. And as much as I did recently kind of bitch about scales and people getting overly obsessed with them, that's really the people who are just at a high level. They're playing every day, and they're focusing way too much energy on their scales when they really could start to branch out. But yeah, if you're going to return after some time off, go through your scales to see where you're at, kind of, just feel yourself out there. Now I will say, in general, the way that I organize my practice, I've always kind of had this idea of, I think you should start with a musicianship skill. I don't know how I feel about that term. I've seen it used. It's basically talking about the in the moment skills, things like sight reading or playing by ear, reading from lead sheet, any of those kinds of things, improvisation. I would say pick one and work on that. And that should be the first thing you do. This is a lot like lifting, where it's like, okay, you want to pick a heavy compound and start with it, and it's because it's going to be the most taxing thing. And if you try to save it for later, you're not going to do it. It's also probably going to be one of the things that gives you the most benefit. So start with that heavy compound thing, and I would say that's any musicianship skills. Pick one of those. Now, if you're at a lower level, you probably want to pick one, because, you don't want... It'll be hard to work on a bunch of them if you're an absolute beginner. As you get more advanced, we can talk about, kind of going to the PPL style route of how to pick those. But anyway, in a given day, pick one of the musicianship skills, Then I would say work on pieces of music. That's normally going to include pieces you've already worked on at least once, or you're picking up a new piece, and so you read through it and work on it in sections. But yeah, a lot of it's going to be you're returning to pieces you have worked on, but it's not sight reading. It's not new material. New material tends to be really exhausting the first time you work on it, but as you work on it, second and third sessions, it's less exhausting. And then I would say always at the end, the lowest priority in a given day would be your technical work. Now, what I will say about the technical work is that if you are not that technically strong of a player, you haven't been playing as long, I would say that should probably honestly comprise the vast majority of the time of your practice. So, like maybe you're going to spend like 10 minutes sight reading and 30 minutes on working through pieces you've worked on, and then spend whatever you have left, 30 minutes, an hour on technical work. Not all in one session, but like spend a lot of time on technique, because then that helps everything else. But I say to put technique, as much as it's important, I say to put it at the end because it's the least mentally taxing thing. You can be drained and still do really good technical work because it doesn't take as much focus. I'm not saying you should space out. I do think there is room and there are reasons to, practice technique while you're like watching something. You can get away with that, or listening to something. I would just caution people, like, know yourself and know if you can still pay attention to the things you need to pay attention to in your technical work with that, and don't do the thing where you just completely tune out and you're not paying attention to what you're doing because you'll let sloppy technique get built in. But if you can adequately, maybe even get warmed up on something technical and then put in the repetitions while kind of half paying attention to something else just to keep yourself doing it more, there is room for a high volume of that. When you're at a very low level of playing, sometimes it's just that is the one area where I would say, yeah, you just kind of need more time doing it and having it under your fingers. I really have noticed that a lot lately with me on guitar because I'm not as good at guitar. And as I'll work on things like scales, I really have noticed the value of, doing position playing scales. I really have noticed the value of, I just need to have this under my fingers more times. I need to have spent more time doing this. And I would say, as much as I'm one who really pushes for you to not get kind of complacent, like those people who are practicing the scales for crazy, whatever, every single day, that kind of lazy practice, stay away from that. But there's room for spending some amount of time letting your brain get used to, like, this is what it feels like to play effortlessly. This is what it feels like to be in control and live in that space a little bit. And I think especially with your technical work, that's a good place to do that. Like, really just settle into where it's like, this is like breathing, and let yourself be used to doing that. And, the technical work, I think that's very important. So, yeah, and I guess if we're going to compare this, to lifting as you're moving up the way, if you're doing the kind of like full body thing, that would be like setting one of these routines and just doing it every day. In the gym, you probably wouldn't. You probably do full body like 3 times a week because you need the downtime. And it's probably worth taking some downtime with piano too, if you can handle it. So, like, if I would say that, unlike the gym, most people are not going to go hard enough with piano to need it, like, on a systemic level. They have just brutalized themselves. But like, if you're a person who's doing it at a very high level and you're getting anywhere in the 2 to 4 hour a day practice range, you might benefit from taking a day off and just letting your brain not work so hard. But yeah, maybe set up a routine that you just do daily. Don't beat yourself up if you want to take a day off. And that's a lot like doing a full body routine in the gym where you're just kind of hitting everything every day. But then, you move on to things like upper lower PPL type lifting splits where you're slowly shifting through what you're going to hit daily. And I think most people would move to this quickly. You'll probably keep your really foundational stuff. If you don't have whatever technical skills, you're going to keep the same technical work for a while until it's really solid. But start having more than one piece, and don't worry about hitting every bar of every piece every day and just kind of cycle through those. You really don't need to hit them every day. Reinforcing your technique every day and reinforcing the same piece of technique or the same large set of technique every day is probably worthwhile until you really have control of it. But with your pieces, letting yourself take a little bit of time between different sections, and letting your brain just kind of like cook that while you're working on something else, it just works wonders when you do that. And I would say with the musicianship skills, the sight reading is kind of complicated because you can't. You just have to pick something up and sight read. Hannah Smith books is kind of progressive in that way, that you can work through it systematically. But it gets harder as you move up. Like you can't. It's very difficult to target things in sight reading, and I guess I'm saying that because if we were talking about something like improvisation, then I would talk very much about working on that in a really, really systematic way, where say you're just like improvising over like a 1/4 progression, right? And so you just like make yourself do. You just use 2 notes. You play with things like accents and accents and articulation and rhythm, and then start adding those. That way you have a super small palette. You want to work with a really tiny palette that's not overwhelming. A big problem with improvisation is like you want to like just jump in and you're playing these huge chord progressions with complicated left hands and have all the notes available to you, including all the chromatic stuff. It's too much. But with improvisation, you really can systematically just add just one more step a day. And I would say even every day you start out that way, where you start with, I'm going to start with 2 notes, 3 notes, and just start adding more notes. And I would say, if nobody's heard this before, I would normally say, you're going to want to start with your pentatonic scale. So, and then add, and then this, right? So 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, and then eventually add 4 and 7. And the reason being that the pentatonic notes are going to fit over like everything. They kind of fit everything that's kind of diatonic chord progression wise. But like 4 and 7 have strong tensions. So that doesn't quite work. But eventually you start to learn how to use that tension. That doesn't even, 7 doesn't work over the 1 and 4 very well. It works once you start adding 5s. But anyway, that's the whole thing. You want to build up systematically towards that with those things. And you can't quite do that with sight reading. But yeah, if you're going to do, a lot of times you can do the same thing if you're doing comping practice or like reading over lead sheets. Pick some easy lead sheets and then pick one pattern and just either play through a whole lot of simple lead sheets, like straight up like nursery rhymes, with one comping pattern, and see if you can make that work over all the different melodic rhythms you would have. So you can actually titrate and control what you're doing systematically with those other musicianships, because it's hard with sight reading. But anyway, but yeah, you should put those things first in your practice, and as you get more advanced, you probably could have a day that you sight read, a day that you improvise, a day that you're just spending on ear training stuff, playing by ear. Pick an easy piece and try to figure it out by ear. You can even dovetail that a little bit with improvisation, because once you've figured something out by ear, then you can start playing with ideas with it improvisationally, mostly by just using embellishments on a given melody. But yeah, start simple and then slowly branch out all of your other stuff. Like I'd mentioned that with your pieces where you're working on multiple pieces and you're cycling through. You can do it with your musicianship skills where you're maybe just having alternating days for different types of things. And then for your technical work, sky's the limit on that. Pick a ton of different stuff. Once you, I would say, scales, like cadences and arpeggios, like absolutely, those are the top priority. Make sure you have those. But then you can really just start adding things. I've mentioned things like sequence patterns before. Any kind of like left hand pattern over chord progression. And then obviously that's the kind of thing where if you're doing this as your technical work in a given day, then you can start to mix that later in a improv session. Now you're doing a real simple improv using a really limited number of notes over a pattern that you have practiced in your technical work that you have really ironed out. So you can see how those things sort of work together. But yeah, there's so much more you can do technically, as I've mentioned, than just scales. And, those are just some ways to sort of organize your practice to get a little bit more out of everything. And as you get deeper, you get to that, I guess, kind of bro split level where you're working on you're working on the tiny detail stuff, the stuff that's getting kind of left behind, and you're paying attention to, what's not getting covered by my big compound stuff. And that's when it just takes a lot of self-assessment. You really have to get in the weeds with your own practice and understand what it is about your practice and about your goals and the things that you're specifically weak at. But, like I'd mentioned earlier, like be careful not to avoid your weaknesses. Like find those weaknesses and work very specifically on those. And, like I said, if you put it into a very strict routine where maybe you have a 3 or 4 day rotation, you just never skip that day. If you really suck at a specific thing and you just don't ever skip the day, if say like ear training is the one that you hate, but you're like, okay, like my next musicianship day is ear training, I have to work on that. Yeah, make yourself do that. And for me, it's a huge thing. And for one, doing the work that I do, I don't get to always have my practice structured the way I would like to, because it's just triage over here all the time, and I'm just doing what I want. My sight reading has gotten a little sloppy, like I mentioned, because of that. And actually, my technical work has fallen off, specifically on organ pedal work. I'm noticing some very specific issues I need to address, like I know I need to work on them, specifically thirds in my feet. And it's hard because I have limited time with an organ, and I'm just trying to keep my head above water. So, that's frustrating. But I will say that when I'm able to be in complete control of my own practice, there are things that I do like to do. Keep in mind with the big 3 things that I mentioned, and these aren't necessarily the only 3 things, they're just the things that I think are kind of the big categories you need to work from. But once you've worked on, you've got those 3 things, you don't have to have them all line up the same way where the same things are always corresponding. I would always have a situation where I might have like 7 technique days and like 3 or 4 musicianship days. So like they kind of rotate over each other in very different ways. So they're not always lining up where it's like 3 of each and everything lines up. So don't feel like things have to be rigid. It's some of that just depends on how you're able to structure it for yourself. I will say that like that becomes a little bit overwhelming. For me in particular, I'm splitting it between so many instruments, and so then I've got, I have 7 technique days, but on 4 different instruments. That becomes cumbersome. But yeah, find something that works for you, and just kind of play with some of these ideas for structuring out how you practice. And if I would say also don't kind of related. Don't be afraid to go back to easier things. There are times with my lifting where I'd reached a plateau, a strength plateau or something, um, and sometimes there's this concept of taking a deload where you just take some time off. A lot of times, yeah, I would take a deload on something where you just you drop the weight. Some people would structure these very, it's one specific day out of their program where they would do this. But for me, I would kind of feel when I needed a deload, and then sometimes I would just drop it way back, and I would just start working on that the progressive overload from the beginning again. So, you know, like straight up, let's say that I was deadlifting a huge amount of weight or whatever, and things were getting a little tense. You're getting a lot of that systemic fatigue that totally happens with practice too, where you're just overloaded by so much happening, like you fed your brain too much and you're tired. But yeah, I would take my deadlifts and I would just drop it off, and I would go back to, okay, I'm going to go from the 400s down to like I'm going to do 3 sets of 8 with 135, just like an absolute piddly weight for me, and I'm going to linearly progress from here. But I'll focus more on my technique along the way. Like, say, with deadlifts in particular, it's like, okay, I will do very controlled descents. I will specifically work on controlled descents, or I'll work on specific parts of the lift where I tend to stick. I'm weak off the floor, so there are ways you can very specifically figure out how to like dial in your technique. And you could do that with piano, where you just say, okay, my scales are at this tempo. What if I just drop them back and I set a tempo limit? I'm not going to like just go to whatever tempo I can get to. I'm going to start my scales at 60, and I'm going to do each hand separately, and I'm going to try to get 3 perfect clean repetitions at 60, up and down 2 octaves or something like that. See if you can do that. And then, okay, if you can, then the next day you move up to 65. You might find that you went from being able to do scales at like 120 and you thought you were doing okay to like you drop it down and you realize, oh, like there's a lot of like little things I needed to work on. And those were the things that were keeping me plateaued at this given tempo. So breaking it back down and then building it back up is really useful. I just really think that people should take that approach more often and be willing to just drop things back in the gym too. So this is just going to be incredibly long. I've rambled a lot, but I hope that I I hope that I answered Mike's question a little bit and then some. And I could definitely go into more detail on some of this, a little more in the specifics. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it for now. I need to go practice organ. Oh, and I will say before I bail, ironically, Ryan, one of my patrons, had mentioned how great it is that I'm finally the gigs have slowed down, and yeah, I just got the dump truck load on me. I probably have 100+ pages of accompaniments that I got in this last week for the upcoming Christmas push. Several choirs, an orchestra. Okay, like it's like a 5th and 6th grade orchestra, and they need like the assistants a little bit. But yeah, I've got a lot of accompaniments on top of all of the like church music programming stuff that's getting out of control because they all want to do big things. It's about to be a nightmare, but I'm gonna try to pop in here occasionally and just I guess shoot from the hip like I did here. But yeah, I need to go practice organ. I have a very large organ prelude this coming Sunday that I probably should not have bitten off, but I did. So I need to go work on that and then go hit the gym. Thanks.